Deep Dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into a situation that's, well, it's dominating headlines, but it's also really shaping global affairs right now. We're talking about the intense, rapidly evolving conflict between Israel and Iran. You see the news alerts, you hear the sound bites, but what's really going on? Because headlines, let's face it, they only ever scratch the surface of something this complex. And this is, frankly, a critical moment. So our mission today is to go way beyond just the immediate events. We're here to unpack the profound ethical and strategic dilemmas at play. Think of this as your shortcut to being truly well-informed. We want to give you the essential context, maybe some surprising facts, and crucial insights you just won't get from a quick news hit.
Right. And to help us navigate this intricate landscape, we're going to explore four key themes. First, we'll set the scene with the precipice of war, the immediate escalating events that brought us here. Then we'll look back at the echoes of the past, showing how history isn't really past, it's deeply influencing today's tensions. After that, we'll tackle the American dilemma, looking at the really tough choices facing the United States. And finally, we'll dig into the human and economic cost, exploring the broader consequences, for ordinary people and the global economy.
It's going to be an illuminating journey, maybe intense at times. So buckle up. You're about to get deeply informed on one of the most pivotal geopolitical moments happening right now.
Let's unpack this.
Okay, so let's start right there at the immediate flashpoint. Because things escalated really quickly, didn't they? The single event that seems to have pushed us right to the precipice, maybe war, was Israel's unilateral military strike overnight on June 13th. And the targets weren't random. They were precise, significant. Iran's nuclear facilities, missile factories, senior military officials, even nuclear scientists.
Yeah, and Iran's reaction was, swift and pretty forceful, as you'd expect. Their foreign minister immediately called the Israeli strike an act of war. That's strong language. And that was quickly followed by Iran retaliating, launching waves of drones and dozens of ballistic missiles toward Israel.
And Israel's justification? Prime Minister Netanyahu put it very clearly. He described it as a last resort effort to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons. That really frames the stakes, doesn't it?
It does. And, a critical detail here, one that often gets a bit lost, is the strategic challenge of targeting the Fordo plant. Just imagine, this facility is buried half a mile deep inside a mountain near Qom. It's designed to be almost impervious. Experts have, for a long time, thought it was beyond Israel's own logistical capability to hit effectively.
Right. So who can hit it?
Well, that's the thing. Only the United States really has the advanced aircraft and these specialized 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs needed to actually destroy it. It really highlights a kind of critical dependency, For Israel to take out Fordo, it almost certainly requires U.S. assets. It's a stark reminder of the limits of unilateral action and maybe a glimpse into that quiet military cooperation happening behind the scenes.
And Natanz was also hit, right?
Yeah.
So it was a broader attack on their nuclear program.
Exactly. Natanz was also targeted, suggesting a pretty comprehensive effort against Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
And speaking of the U.S., how does President Trump's stance fit in? It's been kind of mixed historically, hasn't it? He hasn't ruled out U.S. military intervention now, but I remember him previously questioning if an Israeli attack was wise, saying that would blow it. Now it's just, nobody knows what I'm going to do.
It definitely adds uncertainty. And if we connect this to the immediate military situation, Israel has inflicted considerable damage. They've established aerial dominance. Reports suggest much of Iran's top military leadership was decimated. We're talking Mohammad Bagheri, the military commander-in-chief, and Hossein Salami, head of the IRGC. That's huge. And even though Iran retaliated with, over 350 missiles, most experts seem to agree that Iran simply cannot win a direct head-to-head fight with Israel.
It's jarring how fast this all happened. But, the truth is, these tensions, they aren't new. They're deeply rooted. To really get a grip on the current flashpoint, we need to peel back the layers of history. Maybe start with something many listeners might not even know much about, but which really poisoned the well decades ago.
That's a really important point. How did it get to this point? A critical, maybe foundational wound was the 1953 coup. The U.S. and British intelligence agencies, they directly helped overthrow Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
Right, because he nationalized the oil company.
Exactly. He'd nationalized the British-owned Anglo-Iranian oil company, which was, Britain's biggest company back then. Western powers saw Mossadegh as destabilizing, maybe vulnerable to communism, and definitely an obstacle to their control over oil. The irony, and it's felt deeply in Iran, is that Mossadegh was actually pushing for secular democracy, yet the U.S. helped remove him, installing the pro-U.S. Shah instead. This single event is, widely cited as a huge reason for the deep-seated anti-American feeling that still exists in Iran. It really shaped their national identity.
And here's another historical twist, kind of an irony that really reframes the whole narrative today. That nuclear program causing all the alarm now, the U.S. actually helped Iran start it back in the late 1950s.
That's right, under President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative.
Yeah, they provided the first reactor, and later even weapons-grade enriched uranium. It's kind of wild.
It really is. It shows how today's fears can be rooted in yesterday's maybe well-intentioned actions. Then came the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And that, partly fueled by resentment over the '53 coup, was profoundly anti-American. This all culminated in the hostage crisis. Iranian students took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, held 52 Americans for 444 days.
That was after the Shah was allowed into the U.S. for cancer treatment, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. And President Carter severed diplomatic ties in April 1980. They've been severed ever since. The crisis also pushed out the moderate interim prime minister, Mehdi Bazargan, which kind of cemented hardline influence for the future.
And you can just trace this recurring theme of U.S. sanctions through the decades, right? Carter, Clinton, others, they imposed measures that clearly damaged Iran's economy, but also seemed to just, well, foster more anti-American sentiment. It helps explain, maybe not justify, but explain why things like death to America chants or flag burnings became common. They're expressions of this long history of grievance.
Absolutely. And this historical baggage profoundly shapes the worldview of the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. His leadership is really driven by these revolutionary principles, including death to America, death to Israel. He seems to genuinely believe that any kind of reform, like Gorbachev tried in the Soviet Union, would just make the regime collapse faster, so he resists it fiercely.
So he's in a tough spot now.
You could say that. He's in a bind. He needs to project strength, to save face internally and regionally. But he also seems to fear that if he responds too strongly, it could be fatal for him and his regime. Yeah. He's got this core belief that compromising under pressure just invites more pressure. And it's worth remembering, this nuclear program we're talking about, it's been a 6-decade odyssey for Iran. It's cost them an estimated $500 billion.
Wow, $500 billion. For what return?
Well, that's the thing. It barely provides 1% of their energy needs. So you have to ask, what's the real strategic value beyond maybe prestige or deterrence?
It's just so clear how these historical patterns, intervention, resentment, strategic choices, are still shaping everything today. The mistrust runs so deep on both sides, makes finding any stable resolution incredibly complex.
Okay, let's shift gears now and focus on the American dilemma, because the U.S. faces some incredibly difficult choices here, both ethically and strategically. Bombing Iran, let's be clear, it would be a war of choice for the U.S. It's not like responding directly to an attack on American soil, and that changes the whole dynamic legally and morally.
The legal and political framework is really key here. Under the U.S. Constitution, only Congress has the power to declare war. That's laid out in the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And as you said, Iran hasn't directly attacked the U.S. We're seeing members of Congress, like Representative Thomas Massie and Senator Tim Kaine, introduce measures specifically saying, hey, you need a congressional vote before any offensive U.S. attack.
Right, because old authorizations don't apply here. Exactly. A war against Iran, a sovereign nation, it's just not covered by those decades-old authorizations for use of military force, the AUMFs. Those were written for totally different conflicts, different enemies.
So what are the big arguments against the U.S. jumping in directly, especially given that legal backdrop? Well, there's the obvious risk, isn't there? Getting dragged into another war in the Middle East with American lives at stake. It feels like we've been down this road before. I keep thinking of Donald Rumsfeld's famous line about known unknowns and unknown unknowns.
That's very relevant. Experts are warning the largest perils may lie in the aftermath, just like we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq. The history of regime change wars in the Middle East is, well, hardly encouraging. The unintended consequences could be massive, far outweighing any initial military success. And if we think about the potential consequences if the U.S. intervenes, they're pretty severe. Iran has flat out vowed retaliation against U.S. bases and assets all across the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean. All those places are within missile range.
That's a direct threat.
It is. And analysts like Daniel Kurtzer and Stephen Simon have warned that U.S. involvement in, say, destroying Fordo would put the United States in Iran's sights. That could potentially lead to Iran retaliating by killing American civilians, which would then compel the U.S. to hit back harder, and suddenly you're drawn into the regime change business.
A business most Americans probably don't want to be in again.
Precisely. And that's not even counting other forms of retaliation, like using their fearsome cyber core or attacking oil tankers, making the Persian Gulf just too risky for shipping.
Which brings us to the debate happening right here in the U.S. domestically. There was that recent Economist YouGov poll. It showed, 53% of Trump voters and 60% of all Americans think the U.S. military should stay out. And interestingly, 63% of Trump voters actually support negotiations with Iran. That's quite something.
It shows a real weariness with intervention. And even within the administration, there seems to be a split. You have figures like General Michael Kurilla, described as a hawk of hawks, reportedly pushing for combined U.S.-Israeli operations, but then others, like Undersecretary Elbridge Colby and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, are counseling diplomacy. They're citing constrained U.S. military resources, the need to focus on other big threats, like China.
So it's not just about whether to act, but about priorities and the whole direction of U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly. And history offers another warning sign here, too. Bombing nuclear programs, think Syria or Iraq's Al-Zawrak reactor back in the day, it often hasn't actually eliminated them. In fact, sometimes it just spurs them to build secret programs or become even more determined to get weapons stealthily. Look at North Korea. Despite years of efforts, they now have 60 or more nuclear weapons.
So military action might not even achieve the long-term goal of stopping the program?
It might just push it underground, literally and figuratively. That's the risk.
This really isn't a simple binary choice for the U.S., is it? It's this incredibly complex knot of strategic calculation, moral responsibility, and the potential for huge unforeseen consequences that could echo for decades. So, beyond the military chess game, we have to talk about the wider ripple effects, the human and economic costs. This stuff extends far beyond strategy documents. It hits ordinary people and the global economy hard.
Yeah, starting with the human cost inside Iran itself, sources suggest it's complicated. While some Iranians might have initially applauded precision attacks against, what they see as their oppressors, the continued bombardment of civilian areas seems to be breeding fear, mostly not sparking political rebellion.
Even though the regime isn't popular.
Right. It seems widely unpopular. Maybe 85% of society opposes it. But, and this is crucial, you can't underestimate the depth of support from the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij militia. These are people willing to kill and die for the cause. And paradoxically, U.S. sanctions, while damaging the overall economy, have actually kind of bolstered the IRGC's influence through black market dealings.
And what if the U.S. gets drawn in? What's the risk then?
Well, there's a significant potential for future terrorism and asymmetrical conflict. Think attacks against American embassies, tourists, military bases. It could lock everyone into this awful cycle of strikes and counterstrikes, just causing immense human suffering.
And zooming out regionally, there's that fear of regional spillover, right?
Yeah.
Iran's proxies getting involved.
Absolutely. Groups like the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, they could open up new war fronts that would just destabilize an already incredibly volatile region even further, and the human toll would just multiply. It wouldn't be a contained conflict anymore.
It paints a really grim picture of a wider potential war.
It does. And then there are the critical economic consequences. We have to talk about the Strait of Hormuz.
That narrow waterway.
Exactly. Between Oman and Iran, it's one of the world's most important oil choke points. Connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. The numbers are staggering. In 2024, something like 20 million barrels per day flowed through there. That's about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption.
20%. Just think about that.
I mean, imagine if 1 out of every 5 gas stations worldwide just dried up overnight. That's the kind of scale we're talking about. And we saw a hint of this already. After the June 12-13 tensions, even though traffic wasn't actually blocked, Brent crude oil prices jumped from $69 to $74 a barrel.
Just the threat was enough.
Right. It shows that the inability of oil to transit a major choke point, even temporarily, can create substantial supply delays and raise shipping costs. That inevitably feeds into higher world energy prices. And for most of that oil, there's really no alternative way out of the region. There are some limited pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but they usually don't run at full capacity and couldn't handle the sheer volume.
Who gets hit hardest by disruption there?
Primarily Asian markets. In 2024, about 84% of the crude oil and condensate and 83% of the liquefied natural gas going through Hormuz went to Asia. China, India, Japan, South Korea, together they took about 69% of the crude and condensate. They're heavily reliant.
What about the U.S.?
U.S. imports through Hormuz are actually at their lowest level in nearly 40 years. About 500,000 barrels a day, maybe 7% of total U.S. imports. but the global price impact would still hit everyone, including American consumers.
And a cost to the U.S. isn't just dollars and cents at the pump, right? There's a direct military risk, too. American bases and personnel in the Middle East face significant dangers from Iran's huge stockpile of drones and ballistic missiles. We've already seen that playing out. Over 180 proxy attacks injured U.S. service members just between late 2023 and late 2024. These aren't abstract threats. They're real risks to American lives right now.
Absolutely. And just to put the potential scale of a larger conflict into perspective again, Iran is huge. It's twice the size of Texas, twice the size of Afghanistan, 3 times the size of Iraq. When you think about the long, costly U.S. wars fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, any kind of sustained engagement in Iran would likely be incredibly long, incredibly costly, both in lives and treasure, with consequences we probably can't even fully predict right now.
Wow. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the immediate conflict, that precipice of war, back through the deep historical grievances fueling the mistrust. We've examined the really complex strategic and ethical choices facing the U.S. and looked at the potentially devastating human and economic costs. I think this deep dive has really given us, and hopefully you, a much more multifaceted view of what's arguably one of the most critical global issues right now.
Yeah, and as you, the listener, reflect on all this, maybe keep a few questions in mind. How might the internal dynamics within Iran, the aspirations of its people, that widespread regime unpopularity versus the hardcore loyalists, how might that shape the long-term outcome beyond just military moves? And given these really deep historical roots of mistrust we talked about, what pathways, if any, could possibly lead to a truly stable, lasting resolution here? Is that even possible? And finally, what responsibility do we all have as global consumers, as economic powers, to maybe mitigate the broader human and economic fallout from conflicts like this, especially when vital choke points like Hormuz are involved?
That's a lot to think about. I guess the final thought to leave you with is this. The immediate crisis between Israel and Iran, it's a definite flashpoint, a moment of really high tension. But the true, lasting cost, that's likely going to be measured not just in bombs or missiles, but in those profound ripple effects across the entire region and across global systems shaping our future in ways we're probably only just beginning to anticipate.